And good morning and welcome to the Biometrics panel. My name is Peter O'Neill and I've been reporting on the biometric and mobile ID space for the past 16 years. Oh my gosh. Can I get a show of hands? How many people here today have biometrics enabled on their phones? Just about everybody. Well, when I first started FindBiometrics 16 years ago, biometrics were almost exclusively known as a law enforcement technology. But today I can see that most of the people in this room have biometrics enabled on their smartphones sitting in their pockets. And that's really not a surprise either. The adoption and integration of biometric technology in consumer mobile devices is happening at such a fast rate that Acuity Market Intelligence has stated, and we have the principal of Acuity Market Intelligence here today, in a recent industry forecast that within the next 3 years, literally every single new mobile device on the market will feature built-in biometric security. Now, biometrics refers to the measurement of unique physical features that can be used to verify your identity. And it's really a simple concept that requires advanced technology and has recently become mainstream thanks to the incredible acceleration of innovation in the consumer market. And thank you very much, Apple. That was about 5 years ago when Apple bought the sensor manufacturing company Authentic and really sent our industry moving forward quite fast. And biometrics aren't just fingerprint sensors like Touch ID on the iPhone. All across the industry, we're seeing a trend toward multimodal biometrics that take into account the choice for the end user. Face, iris, voice, vein pattern, fingerprint, walking gait, behavioral biometrics is big now. And even cardiac signature are becoming options for users across industries as diverse as healthcare, fintech, enterprise, government services, and most recently, IoT, automotive, and robotics. And watch out what happens when 5G technology arrives in a very short period of time. In fact, every single industry and enterprise is adopting biometrics, especially as logical, physical, digital, and mobile security come crashing together within every company worldwide. When we talk about biometrics in 2017, we're finding ourselves talking less about individual niche applications and more about identity as a whole. Universal ID, credentialing users for access to the digital and physical spaces that need protecting. And today we are here truly with the industry's top experts in biometrics to talk about best practices and deployments and to address some of the skepticism that still surrounds this technology that's changing the ways we react with our identity every single day. Welcome to the new ideas in access control, physical and information security in our connected world. And now I'd like to introduce our panel. As I'd mentioned, Maxine, who is the principal of Acuity Market Intelligence, Mark Clifton, CEO, Princeton Identity, Bianca Lopes, VP, BioConnect, and Eileen, Sexton, Senior Director, Federal Government Business Development, ImageWare Systems. Now, we've got a lot to cover off today, and start thinking about your questions because I will be checking with you to get questions at the end, so start thinking about questions you might have for our panel. But to start off, first question. People are used to thinking of physical and logical access as two separate things, but they are quickly overlapping to form a type of hybrid access control. Are biometrics enabling the convergence of these two worlds, or are they just well suited to take advantage of this trend? And maybe Max, I could ask you to start off.
Okay. Well, what I think is really interesting about the integration of physical and logical access is it's been talked about for quite some time. And access control is still primarily driven by the old line physical access players. And people have talked about that transforming radically. I think what's really changing the equation is what's happened with mobile devices. The fact that everyone is walking around with a smart device in their pocket. As Peter said, these are all almost all biometrically enabled devices. And so that changes the equation in terms of how you get access to physical spaces and to digital assets. More and more, we're seeing the phone used as a primary or secondary authentication mechanism. You combine biometrics with that, and really, now what you're saying is you're taking the primary capabilities and the of authentication and moving that to a device you have in your hand. So whether it's a physical access or logical access really becomes irrelevant because you have your own personal authentication device. So I think we're really going to see some acceleration in the next 2 to 5 years in this area, and eventually I don't think we'll even be talking about these two, physical and logical access as two distinct disciplines. We're just going to be talking about access control or digital access, and it'll all kind of be integrated.
Anybody else?
Well, I think that the move to, especially in the physical access world, the move to IP, Internet Protocol, you see whole security departments now being put under the IT department. So you're starting to see security and IT merge as functional organizations. So I think the same thing you're going to see physical access and logical access merge as well. And it'll all be IP based. I mean, that's where it's going. It's not there yet, but it's coming.
The other thing I would add to this that I find really interesting is the barrier to entry. So you're touching it from the convenience factor of you carry a phone, so now that becomes your identity, that becomes your mobile authenticator. When you look at the history of biometrics, the sheer cost of refurbishing an infrastructure or buying a biometric reader was somewhat prohibiting in certain organizations or locations. You wouldn't see it in a branch infrastructure where they have like thousands and thousands of branches in financial sector. Now you're seeing them going, actually, I need my workforce to be mobile. So I need you to work in this location today, but I need you to work in that location tomorrow. And then a regulatory body is going to say, I actually need an auditing system. So now when you're looking and saying that here's mobile authenticator, I can pick up the geolocation of where the employee is, and that actually connects to your access control system and it lets you in. I think you're seeing why you're seeing that convergence happen. And I totally agree with Maxine. It's not going to be, here's your physical strategy, here's your digital strategy. Actually, here's your people strategy or your identity strategy.
And I would concur with Mark that the physical and the logical access in the government space where I focus, they have spent a lot of time getting the HR department and the security department and the IT department all to understand that we're all working on the same problem. So they all are collaborating, coordinating, and setting regulations and policies to accommodate that integration.
Okay, so there is this trend in which physical and logical are obviously converging. Will it include things like financial transaction authentication, travel screening, all sorts of other things? What else will start to be included in this? Bianca?
I think I started by talking about banking, but I think you're already seeing this in financial transactions. When you look at where the world's going in terms of financial transactions happening on mobile, e-commerce going towards mobile commerce, I think it's naive to think that identity and biometrics certainly is a choice because you can pick up just about 6 or 7 different types of biometrics using a simple phone. So enabling that balance between security and friction, I think it's where most financial institutions, healthcare institutions, or large enterprises struggle with today. But I don't think there's a question, at least not in my mind, or when you look at trends, that people will be doing transaction verification and actually exchange of any value. It's going to be a question now for me about how much data do I give for how much am I getting? How much of my identity am I giving you for what service you're providing me, and what's going to enable that? I think it's certainly a combination of things like biometrics, like behavioral. So I don't think it's a question.
Okay. Anybody else?
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it's interesting if you look at the sort of from the financial services perspective in the consumer world, that's one part of the equation. And then, you mentioned travel, and I think I was just having this discussion with a colleague about, what's happening in terms of border control and facilitation through airports. And that's a little bit different because one of the things that I was discussing is that you don't really own your passport. The State Department owns your passport. So you have to give them certain information to get that credential to allow you to travel internationally. So there's a totally different relationship in that regard. And yet I still think there's going to be a connection between, this notion of access, facilitated access through a port space, an airport or seaport or land border, where you have this credential, and that is, I still believe it's going to be linked perhaps to our mobile devices, perhaps to a on-site, managed network that just a secure network for that particular space. For example, I think you'll go and you'll link your credential to your identity, and you might use your mobile phone for that. You might use a kiosk. You might there might be some other means to facilitate that process, and then you're going to have an identifier that you are issued, which is a single token identifier, which is going to grant you access through that space for just a short period of time. I currently think Iris is probably a great biometric for that. So you're granted the single token biometric. It travels with you for just that experience of moving through the airport, perhaps when you board the plane, perhaps when you arrive at your destination, and then that identifier goes away. And so there's, biometrics in that respect. It's a different context, but it's also facilitating you're facilitating an access process, and it's linked, I believe, eventually to your mobile phone, if not initially, because I think the credentials are going to live in the mobile phone too. So,
I've got just one comment. All of the biometrics and the adoption of the biometrics won't happen unless it's convenient. And when I say convenient, think about what the U.S. has finally done. They've added a little more security to your credit card. They put the chip in there. But everybody hates the chip because it's 5 times longer to do a transaction. If it's not convenient, no one will adopt it. No one will use it. So it has to be convenient, but you can get convenience and security in the same devices.
Unless they're forced to. I mean, that's unfortunately the reality.
You usually don't have a good result when you force the
Exactly.
public to do things. That's just typical.
There's also another element in the biometrics. Is we're talking here about voluntary causes, and like the State Department, you have to give up certain information to get your passport. There's a whole group of people who are employed for different companies that are saying, we want biometrics, we want to know who's coming in and out of our facility, and that's not even going to be a choice. We are going to have to do it for our employers. The government is mandating it for their employees, and who's going to control all these biometrics and manage them is a big problem. So sometimes you have to give up, again, the privacy element. So those policies have to be put in place. It's a big concern.
Very good point. What markets, what vertical markets are we starting to see this blending of physical and logical? Where is it happening most rapidly? Eileen, maybe you could start us off on this one.
Yeah, I think that's a tough question because I think it's happening everywhere. I think finance, healthcare. I focus on government, but I know NIH is working on a project where they want to enroll 1 million people and do precision medical initiative to track drug programs to track people's health. Well, in order to do that, they're going to collect a biometric to facilitate that. And so, again, big move in healthcare for electronic health records. They want to employ a biometric to make sure the people we're tracking, the right leg doesn't get cut off when the record says the left leg. This is a perfect application for biometrics. FinTech, we've talked about that. People want that. Wells Fargo, Bank of America, they're all looking at biometric solutions. In the government space, I wanted to share a quote. I think it's very interesting. They're talking about kinetic attacks. And one of the things that's going to, I think, spur this, if there's a big incident like there was this weekend, and typically that's when people will move and react, the president last week put out an executive order, again, which follows on from the Bush administration and the Obama administration. There's been a lot of focus on this. His executive order said that all agencies, number one, should protect federal networks. Really? Update antiquated systems. Again, this was last week. And 3, instruct agencies to work together.
Well, good
Well,
luck.
this has been going on for a long time. So these are challenges that have to be overcome. But I thought it was an add-on to that was a gentleman who works for Patrick McBride, he gets the credit. He works for Clarity over in Reston, their computer security company. He said that much of the control infrastructure in the whole country in place, and many of the networks that underpin this infrastructure are 15 to 20 years old and even older. The highlight here is the internet was nascent and didn't exist at the time these systems were commissioned. Now that is frightening, and what the president is asking for is kind of like stating the obvious. Again, I think biometrics, PACS, and LACS solutions are going to be the underpinning to support all these infrastructures or networks that are old, and they're going to be a critical piece of it, because if you don't get the first piece right, the whole rest of it is falls down like dominoes.
Can I make a
Go.
So the one thing that I think was also really interesting is you think about, okay, we're going to integrate biometrics into physical access. Even if you just think about it on that level, there's a logical access component associated with, okay, who's now looking at the records? Who's looking at the data? You have to have an audit trail because this is such because it's intimate PII in a way. People think about their biometrics that way. You want to make sure that everybody who's looking at the data and accessing the systems, you know who they are too. And this is one of the things that I always find really interesting is people talk about, biometric ATMs. It's great. They have biometrics on the front, but the guy that's going in the back to load the money, does he have to use his biometrics to get in there? So I think you start thinking about the way these systems physically and logically interact and interconnect, and it's very complex, and it totally makes sense that this is moving towards an integrated IT vision of what access control looks like.
What I was going to say is what we were talking about earlier. It's this whole notion about who is going to adopt it first. Like, I would love to sit here and say I would love to see Canada, single payer system, healthcare. You would think it would make sense that they're going to decide and integrate biometrics. There's 14 electronic medical record systems. Like, they can't even get their act together to decide on one system, let alone one identity sovereign or biometric provider or underlying technology for that matter. So when you ask what industry do I see, at least in our experience in the company, adopting this the fastest is actually the private sector. So it's where does it solve a real business problem that P&L can see the ROI? So whether that's going to be commercial banking because they existing have an operating line that says, I need to use tokens and I'm regulatory mandated to use tokens, then okay, now I have a budget line, I'm going to adopt. So I'm seeing that happen the fastest there because they can see the ROI right away, and the decision making is far from perfect, but a little less sort of process driven than I would anticipate seeing it in government or healthcare.
Very good. We started to touch on some of the challenges that we need to address before we see fully integrated universal access scenario. What are some of the challenges that we face through this whole process? And Mark, can you start us off on this one?
Yeah, I think some of the challenges are obviously people and their adoption. Do they want to do it or not want to do it? If there's a benefit, they'll do it. You give up all your information to Google or Apple when you sign up on your phone. And you agree to it because it's convenient. You get to use the platform. You get to use these things, so you do it. So people are a big piece of that, but organizations also are a big piece of it too, because you have to be able to trust the organization. If they're going to have your private information, your biometric, you have to trust them. And so they have to step up on their security side, because the cybersecurity falls right into this as being one of the biggest issues in the adoption of any of the private information. You have to protect that information. You have to make it secure. And the systems have to be secure. The systems that you use for on your phone or whatever, if they're not protecting that information properly, and there's lots of ways to do it, and most of them are, then you're exposing your biometric or your private information to hackers or to somebody with nefarious purposes. So I think it's people and it's organizations and trust have to all go together for this to really go.
I'm just going to add something here that we think a lot about. If the trust element and tracking that trust gets a lot easier when the identity authentication has taken place, and you have a pool of 1,000 people, and 2 or 3 of those people don't want to give up the biometric. They don't want you vetting them deeply. Those people hopefully don't get in the system. if some people, bad actors, like the continuous monitoring is critical because you could get in the system, then something changes. And the continuous vetting, the continuing monitoring of behavior, I think is critical. So you have the biometric the person is in, that's well and good. How do we make sure that person maintains or continues to be that same person? We had a speaker yesterday that calls into question, how do you monitor people continuously? Because one of the things there is people's attitudes change, their circumstance change, they could be compromised. How do we know that we can pick them out of the pool? I think limiting the pool makes it easier then to say, well, these are the people that we have to pay attention to. Because we can't monitor everyone. It's a physical impossibility. But if we can red flag a couple of people, it makes the job easier for the security folks, for the trust element.
I think some of the challenges are not so, like, I think when I hear you both speak, I hear education, right? Like, I think you're still getting people asking, we were laughing in the speaker, and like, you still get people asking us about creepiness or saying things like retina scans, or is it going to hurt my eyes, or are you actually storing my face or my finger or my voice? So I think that the industry as a whole still has to educate, and large enterprises, even though they want to innovate, like they are often in this like death by POC land. I see them doing proofs of concepts or building their digital labs, and then they'll say, look at what we're doing. And then when you get to the InfoSec folks, or when you get to procurement, and they ask you things like, okay, where has this been deployed I need a 5-year track record, and I need this number of millions of deployments, and I need this error rate. And you're looking at them going, this is brand new technology. Like, you're not going to have that sort of history to a certain extent. And maybe the history is physical because the history of physical exists for years. And they still seem to somewhat think that, well, no, physical is over here. If you've been able to secure the Pentagon, you can't secure my mobile app, and you're sitting there going, God. So I think that's still some of the challenges I certainly see in the industry as a whole.
And I think this also plays into the fact that we don't have a really good testing and evaluation process for deploying biometrics. There are some standards, but we don't. Companies that are integrating this technology are doing a lot of testing and piloting on their own, because there's no certification. If there was a process where this technology, we had certain standards in terms of performance, in terms of human interaction, in terms of privacy, meeting privacy and regulatory requirements, and that we could show that these technologies had been certified, then it'd be a lot easier for these large-scale organizations to go, okay, the same way that I'm not buying a power supply that hasn't been, certified, that's not going to blow my building up. I don't want to integrate this technology if I don't have some trust. And so I think that's going to be an important component of really the broad mainstreaming of this technology for integrated physical and logical access. Because the physical access components of traditional wired systems, there's lots of regulations and standards, and people aren't concerned. What are you wiring my building? There's an understanding that you're certified, it's fine. It's not gonna blow up or catch on fire. So I think people still there's a sort of a digital equivalent of worrying about this stuff basically blowing up or catching on fire that we have to deal with.
And making sure it's not biased, because I think the industry tried to get into a standard for fingerprint technology and still not a standard fully, right? So I think that there's also that conversation, and then when you get to convenience, you see people like Fido try to have a standard in terms of, but then you can't port that identity, so then you ask the question
Fido,
about
I think
if it's going to be super connected, is
right.
It has to be portable.
Well,
don't make me re-enroll here.
Right, and the FIDO standard's important. I think it's
Totally.
One really critical piece, but I think there's other standards and certifications that need to be established. And the industry's been struggling with this for a while. It's not an easy problem to solve because this is inherently strange technology, because it's bridging what I call the human-machine identity gap, right? The human factor here is unpredictable, and so it's complex. But I think until we can find a way to address those challenges, it's going to be very hard to get the kind of large-scale buy-in and allow companies of all sizes that don't have the resources to go spend time and money piloting and testing in their own labs or inside the organizations.
But as we see the speed of the industry, you know, as soon as Apple bought Authentic 4 or 5 years ago, the industry certainly moved ahead quickly. Look what's happening in India right now. Do things like that help the cause? So when you're talking, Bianca, you're talking about some of the challenges that you deal with within large corporations. You know, do you reference things like the Aadhaar project or
Totally, or the Estonian government, or like I can go on forever, but I still feel like there is but it didn't happen in that's India. It didn't happen in my country, or it didn't happen in the bank next door, or in the social network. And what I find fascinating, it still goes back to that. So everyone has been sort of, especially in the financial services industry, sort of been forced to do the Touch ID integration, whether they liked it or not. Clients were just, what's up with this password and PIN? I want to use this thing. Get it going. And when you actually look into the security of it, all they get is a token saying yes or no. And it could be my husband on my phone. And so back to the convenience factor, the clients and the customer forced it. So as much as I think, so answering your question, like, does it help? Absolutely. You're starting to see mass, but I think it helps more from the factor that now those customers maybe will immigrate and come to Canada and go, I could do that over there, or come to the United States and say, could I please get this, and customers will demand it. I think that's what the change will really be, personally, anyways.
The consumers adopting will drive the adoption in business. There's no question about that. It will absolutely force it, and because they're going to demand it. Look, I can do this on my phone. Why can't I do this on my bank account? I mean, what's up with this? So I think, you know, in the fintech industry, and the reason they're adopting is because they're scared to death of what people want for convenience and what they expect from their bank or whatever for convenience. So they're going to become obsolete if they don't figure it out. I mean, that's what they're scared of. And I don't think people realize that they're working very hard to try to solve these problems. But a lot of banks are old institutions. They don't move very fast. So, you know, we'll see. But things like Venmo scare them to death.
Well, I also think that, you know, part of what happened when Apple put the sensor on the phone was they created a competitive race in a industry that has essentially provided a global platform for communications and mobile access. And one of the factors has always been with biometrics is, well, you know, how do you create a platform? Well, you got to deploy all these readers. So according to the research that my company's done, there's 1 billion biometric smartphones out in the world right now. That's a huge platform for biometrics. And so it's done a couple things. One, it's taken the fear factor away because I'm not afraid of my smartphone. It's also educated people and trained them. One of the biggest issues biometrics had for a long time was just training people to use biometrics. Now we have a training platform, and I would argue that the current state of fingerprint sensors on our smartphones is not security. It's really for convenience, but it has had a tremendous impact in user acceptance and user adoption. And so then, that, you know, as you're saying, that if you can do it on your phone, then your expectation is that you can do it in other places. And so I think that's critically important too in terms of overcoming obstacles and just moving this industry forward.
Well, you mentioned passwords, you know, and the fact that fingerprint sensors are more for convenience, but they're a heck of a lot more secure than what we had in the past.
Oh yeah, I'm just saying that you can work around if your finger doesn't work, you put in your PIN code and you still get into your phone.
Yeah, but so, the data that I think the point that to me is interesting is it's actually not that it is more secure, but it's the data that you're getting from it over time. Right. So if I'm a large institution, I'm looking at it and saying, actually, I want to get array. I'll do Touch ID just fine, but I'm going to look at other biometrics because I can get more data and a higher degree of assurance. And actually, that notion of that continuous authentication or that dynamic identity, because Bianca ages every day, and if all I'm getting is a token or a key saying yes or no, I'm not actually getting how Bianca changes over time.
Right. I'm just saying that I think it's important that people understand that what they're dealing with on their smartphones is not yet what I would call a hardened biometric authentication.
Totally.
Okay, and I would also suggest that Apple, when it launched Touch ID and the fingerprint sensor on the phone, also made biometrics, for the first time ever, cool. Up until then, as I mentioned,
You mean the
biometrics
Nexus isn't cool when you
were,
go
were,
like this?
were for a long time law enforcement, and it was like, oh, give my fingerprint, that means I'm going to be arrested. There was a lot of that going on. And then all of a sudden, almost overnight, the industry changed, and it became cool to do this, and also very much more secure than what was in the past. So I just want to get a couple more questions in here. Think about the questions that you might have for our panel, please. Multimodal biometrics have become expected, and now that new flagship smartphones like the Samsung Galaxy S8 are shipping with fingerprint, face, and iris, how important has user choice been in popularizing biometric access control? And is this going to continue this multimodal approach, or will there still be areas for a single modality?
I think you need multimodal, and the reason to me is really simple. You hear this like buzzword, omni-channel authentication, right? So how not every single biometric is going to make sense for that specific use case. So maybe voice is great for passive or the call center as an example, and maybe I'm in a quiet area and I should maybe be logging into something and I want to log into something, and I could just look at my phone and I'm doing a facial recognition or an iris recognition. So I think the need for choice as you look at an enterprise is only further enabled by the phone. So the phone can pick up multiple biometrics, and I think you need them for a different. I'm always talking about what's your product strategy versus what's your channel strategy. How are you reaching that customer? And then what biometric makes sense from a convenience as well from a security perspective. So I absolutely think that it's not going to be one that's going to win and you're going to now standardize it all in one particular biometric. That's going to be the end all be all answer.
We've also been focused on multimodal for years, and one of the concepts is, again, the situational, the environmental. You know, where am I enrolling? Can you see me? Is there noise? Is there background? The ambient noise for the voice, you couldn't be able to use that. The other factor is physical limitations. Some people may have fingerprints that aren't able to gather. There'd be cultural considerations. Is there a religious or a reason for not offering up a specific biometric? So if you give people options, there's less user friction. We talk about user acceptance. You want to make this as inclusive as possible, because there will be a myriad of situations going, putting something out at this scale in a global way.
Well, I also think, too, you have to look at what the future is of biometric authentication and the difference between active biometrics and passive biometrics. In other words, I believe the future is you're going to pick up your phone and it's going to recognize you. And I don't know whether it's going to be your heartbeat or your skin or, it doesn't matter. I don't want to have to actually do something. I just want to be able to, pick up my phone, or open my car door and it knows that it's me. There's other times maybe I want to transfer $10,000 in my bank account into to pay, pay my stockbroker or something. And then I want active biometrics. I want to know I'm doing that. I want feedback on that process. I want to have some control over, So I think that you have to think about that too. When you talk about access control, the scenario might be, you walk into a building and you're walking through a space where maybe, they're catching your face and your iris as you walk in the building and you're just getting authenticated. But then I want to go into the, main server room and I want to do something that is active in that process. So I think there's different layers and levels to how, what kind of biometrics, whether they're active or passive, and how that relates to the access control scenarios.
Just one comment. In my work with Samsung, adding all the different biometric features, and there's more coming. They're going to add, voice and all these other things, and they might already have some of it. So they want to give the consumer a lot of choice to see, give them the options of what they want to do. Now that is multimodal on a phone, but another combination of biometrics is multimodal. So if you really want to have some very secure authentication, you might combine the face and the iris, or the fingerprint and the iris, or you go through these combinations of things where you can really increase the security of the authentication without actually inconveniencing the person. So if you add those other layers, the spoofing, which is always an issue with any of these, is it really the person, or are they faking the fingerprint? If you use a single biometric, spoofing can happen. If you use multiple biometrics, it's very difficult. So you've raised the security level tremendously when you're using a multimodal approach in your security system, and you don't necessarily have to inconvenience the user to do that. So,
And piggybacking on what Mark said too, in a security model, you can change it up. Yesterday we were asking you to submit your fingerprint. Maybe in March we might decide that we're going to have people do their face. So the element of the unknown in security is also a huge advantage, and it's a tool that can be used. These are all just tools.
Right, or if you know you have a notice of a perceived threat that might be coming in, either physically or logically, right? You can also modify the security protocol. And I think it's important to remember with biometrics that these technologies, some of these technologies have been around for a long time, face, iris, fingerprint, voice. But ultimately what we're doing with biometrics is we're recognizing humans by some pattern recognition on some part of their physical being. And that can change and evolve over time. Particularly as some of these technologies get better at, I don't want to say scanning because we're not doing any scanning, but recognizing people, whether it's their gait or, I don't know, it could be the color of your hair, who knows what, you're going to be able to pick up. And so I think, we have to, again, think about, what's passive and what are you asserting, and how do those fit together in a particular scenario to solve a problem.
And I don't know if you agree with this, Maxine, or not, but I also think it's not just biometrics. So when you're talking about that passive, all the other technologies about your geolocation, like your device ID, is it really the device number that you put you said it is in there? So what are the other things that you're sort of picking up on the background? So you hear this word a lot, and you can run basic regression models of understanding how is someone changing. And then if you're sitting in the InfoSec's room or the CIO's room, maybe you know that there's an attack or a risk perceived in a specific city like London, and now you can trigger that. If you're in London, now you're going to do multimodal.
Or something as simple as this person generally comes in the building between 9 o'clock and 9:15, and now it's 11:30 at night. Yeah.
All of this is bringing it all together. So it's not just biometrics. It's all these little elements of metadata that say something's amiss here. Again, and this is huge information. And with big data and predictive analytics getting better and better and scaling, it's all doable now. It may not have been doable in times past, but it's doable.
Yeah, and this is totally, again, goes back to Mark's point, which is why this is driving towards totally existing in an IT infrastructure. Because this notion that physical access is somehow independent or separate is, it's just no longer valid.
I'm now going to open it up to the floor. Are there any questions for our panel today? Yes.
To the mic.
I was just wondering if you could just talk about some of the challenges of everything being, from a hardware perspective, being so fragmented, right? Like Samsung's has specialized hardware, Apple's has specialized sensors, and then you still have kind of the old world fingerprint touch sensors that you see everywhere. And so could you just talk about some of the challenges from our perspective that presents?
Well, some of it has to do with algorithms, right? So as there's more standardization in image capture, it's really the ability to manage the algorithms. And so when that's done on a device level, then you're talking about local authentication to that device. When you're using the device to capture information and then the processing is done, in a cloud environment, then that's a different situation. So it really depends on how you structure the solution space that you're operating in terms of hardware and software and how it's connected.
Do you see the world moving away from specialized sensors or hardware for capturing biometrics?
I personally do. I've been talking about that for 15 years. So I believe ultimately we're moving towards eventually sort of abstract pattern recognition algorithms. And what you submit to that algorithm, whether it's the back of your hand or the side of your face or your eyes or whatever, I think ultimately we may be moving towards something at that level. But I think that's kind of that's a pretty big picture vision.
Yeah, when you look at that question, to me, one thing that I would add is it's understanding how you take sort of a platform approach to the problem, because historically it's been a point-to-point integration, because you have every vendor saying mine is the greatest and best, and here, come do this integration. And once you've done the integration, you're sort of handcuffed to that technology, and there's usually no portability. So it's really, what's your encryption? How can you revoke that token? Is that token something that are you making me re-enroll on my face if I'm doing a Samsung versus an iOS? So I think it's asking those questions when you're dealing or evaluating vendors, which goes back to the fact that there's not a lot of education on that space. And then how, if you're doing a server matching, then you get into the whole conversation about, are you doing homomorphic encryption when you're bringing that token back from the server, and are you ensuring who owns that privacy, who owns that data, who owns that token? So I think that there's a whole other slew of issues and concerns and questions that have yet to be addressed.
And it's a reflection of the evolution of the industry, that we're no longer focused just, okay, it's this hardware reader and I got to make it really work and I'm going to stick it on your door, right? It really speaks to the evolution of the technology, the performance of the technology, the price performance curves, that we're now talking about solution spaces and how do you operate in an IT infrastructure, not just like, oh, I'm going to take this thing and slap it on the door so people can get in or not.
So one good example, I think, of where the hardware's going is when I first got into this, the biometric business back in 2008, our initial iris recognition systems filled half a classroom and had 16 cameras and cost $250,000, and now it's on a phone. So I mean, okay, so that took 8 years.
On a basic SDK with a set of resting APIs, so it's not scary.
That's amazing.
But it tells you where it's headed, and so you're going to see the hardware become commoditized, and a single device will have multiple sensors built into it, and that'll be what it is.
Well, and the other point that Mark made to me yesterday, because Princeton Identity makes these really cool iris recognition readers, is that they put this reader on the door. With their reader, it does something unique. If you take it off the door, then all the data goes away. So these are the kind of things you start thinking about when you get past half a room and $250,000 worth of technology, right?
Next question, please.
Yeah, so it's really kind of related to the gentleman's question. It's all about educating the firms that are out there wanting to leverage this technology, but all they go to is vendors, and vendors are going to say, "Hey, I got the best thing for you." What's your suggestion on how to cut through that? What are some organizations that kind of specialize in education of the industry to say, "Hey, here's what's out there, and here are the things that you need to be aware of before you jump into this vendor relationship"?
So one example is some big firms that we work with that are going to this. What you see is that they actually do their own due diligence, and they probably all have their own laboratories and things like that for testing, but they almost have to do, depending on the size of the corporation, they have to do a certain level of that themselves just to be sure that it is indeed going to work for them and their concept of operations and things like that. Certainly the government does that, large corporations are doing that, but that process can take 2 to 3 years. So I'm a small business. I can't hold my breath for 2 or 3 years if it's a really a good client or whatever. So that's not a great cycle for me. So I think the suggestion that there's an independent laboratory, whatever UL listed or whatever, that does this sort of thing, I think would definitely help the industry. And I know that the Security Industry Association is pushing forward with some biometrically enabled standards in their access control, some of their standardization they're trying to do. To really try to drive the industry towards standardization so that at least there's commonality back to making a single kind of piece of hardware that does everything. It's starting to happen. How long it takes, it'll be hard to tell.
Well, I'm going to make a shameless plug, but Peter understands the industry quite well and often produces in FindBiometrics lots of reports regarding good, bad, and ugly of the technology. Maxine is no different. You're starting to see some large consulting firms like the Deloittes, the Accentures of the world, write and publish. The World Economic Forum did a whole report. It's like 118 pages. It's awesome in terms of what is that digital identity. But start with the basics. As an actuarian, I would say look at their FAR and FRR graphs. They're all going to publish their metrics. So if you just take all of them and put them on the same graph scale, you're going to start to see the differences. So I think it's understanding the basic measures of what problem you're trying to solve. What is the client experience going to look like? Is this have to be portable? So if you're a large enterprise, you likely need this to be compatible to multiple operating systems. So if you start there, you're going to start to wean off a lot of people that can't answer those questions. That would be my best piece of advice for an enterprise looking at deploying a biometrics.
Yeah, I think there are some small specialized companies that look at this. I don't mean to diss any of the large consulting companies, but my experience with them is
I
that
started with your plug.
I know because well, I'll just say this. Last year there were a couple of very large acquisitions in our industry, and I got a lot of phone calls. And the phone calls were coming from the big name consulting companies because they don't know. They don't have the expertise. That's the problem. I've been at this for
And they have vendor relationships.
I've been at this for
specific
17
OEM
years.
vendors.
Peter's been at it, I think, for almost that long. There are a few known people. It's not hard to find them because there are not that many of us. But you need to find someone who's truly independent, and who has the expertise and who's not going to go hire a bunch of 25-year-olds to go try to do some research for you. I think it's pretty sophisticated stuff, and it has been a niche market, and what I see now, is it's hot. There's a lot of people jumping on it, whether it's market research companies or big consulting firms, whoever. And I think you got to do some due diligence and really make sure that you have some independence advising you, and that those folks actually do know what they're talking about.
Yeah, history matters, right? Like, I think that's the biggest thing. Like, we were talking earlier, how you can just do it in your phone. So yes, 2 kids in a basement can probably build technology. So don't be so naive of not looking at the physical space and seeing people that have started there, that understand large deployments, sets, and how the actual biometric technology functions.
Question?
Yeah. Question, in the private sector, is there some or some of the concerns about adoption of biometrics for employees and customers waning with the advancement of technology and proliferation? About, if you're using biometrics, you have to figure out a way of protecting it since it's such sensitive PII. What kind of dialogue's going on in the private sector on those things?
Well, my experience has been that there's a lot more adoption happening. You're starting to see some major companies just, they get an evangelist in there, he gets a budget, and he decides he really wants to do some of this. And you do need some inside the business support, because it is new to a lot of people. Again, once it's on their phone, it won't be so new, but it's still very new to a lot of corporations. So they are, they're kind of putting their toe in the water right now, and they absolutely are looking at ways to do this. That's convenient, though. I mean, I think cost and convenience are really going to drive a lot of it. And then if you can provide the security on top of that without creating, they have to do something special to use it. It really does help the adoption, and you'll start to see it happening in a lot of places.
I'll add a little bit to that the adoption is going to be somewhat easier too, because a lot of these things are being made available in SaaS models or IDaaS models. So when people are moving this information, this capability to the cloud, people are less afraid of taking on the cost, the capital expense cost of doing it in-house if you're a Walmart or somebody like that, and they can, outsource that element. Again, from the federal government perspective, the federal government is very much on board with shared services. They're very much on board with outsourcing this. They know that AWS and all these other services have this capability. So that's a way to jump on board without the huge expense.
And that, unfortunately, will be the last word. Feel free, if you have questions, to come up to the panel afterwards. Thank you very much for attending our panel today, and thank you, panelists. Wonderful job.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.